Hey guys, welcome back to another video. And in today's video, I want to talk about why the Sega Genesis was faster than the Super Nintendo. Now, for years, I thought the Super Nintendo was faster than the Genesis in every way. Turns out that's not the case. But before I tell you what about the Genesis was faster than the Super Nintendo, I just want to tell you real quick what I think about the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. Now, I own the Sega Genesis, but I didn't own a Super Nintendo. But on the Sega Genesis, there were so many games. The games that stand out in my mind is Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, the Sonic games, Comic Zone, and Vector Man. But guys, there were a whole lot more games on the Sega Genesis that I played and I enjoyed. But those were just some of the few games. Sega had released a 6-button controller for fighting games. So you had X, Y, Z, ABC instead of just ABC on the original controller. And the D-pad on that controller was super smooth, so you could pull off combos easily in games like Street Fighter. Now, let me tell you what my thoughts on the Super Nintendo. Now, I never owned a Super Nintendo. I almost did, but that's another story. The Super Nintendo, I went to my friend's house, and played the Super Nintendo, and the Super Nintendo was an amazing system as well. The games that I remember is like Mario games, Donkey Kong, and I didn't play Final Fight, but Final Fight was like similar to Streets of Rage, and that was a game that was only on the Super Nintendo. Final Fight wasn't on the Sega Genesis, but Sega Genesis owners did have Streets of Rage, which I played and I loved Streets of Rage. Now the only thing about the Super Nintendo controller that I didn't like was that it was kind of stiff, really stiff, and you had to like use it a lot just to get it to be a little bit smooth. So for me, that Sega Genesis 6-button controller was the best controller, even better than the Super Nintendo controller. But would I put the Genesis above the Super Nintendo? No. I look at both platforms as equal. They both had great games on both systems, so I wouldn't put one above the other. So that's my take on both consoles. Now, I'm gonna tell you what about the what about the Sega Genesis that is faster than the Super Nintendo. Now, both consoles had 16-bit CPUs, but the difference was in the CPU speed, which I didn't know this. So the Super Nintendo CPU runs at 2.68 megahertz, and the Sega Genesis CPU run at 7.67 megahertz. Now, it's really a tiny fraction, but the Super Nintendo, the Genesis was more than double. That's more than double the Super Nintendo. And that's why I guess Sega came up with terms like blast processing back in the day. And now, the RAM on both consoles, the Super Nintendo had 128 kilobytes of RAM, while the Sega Genesis had 64 kilobytes of RAM. So that explains, also the Super Nintendo had 32,000 colors, while the Genesis only had 512. So that explains why just Super Nintendo games had more color. Let's be real, guys, Sega Genesis games were pretty dark, but there were some games that did have color in it. For those who back in those days did play those systems. So now, and the sprite size on the Super Nintendo was 64 times 64, while the Genesis was only 32 by 32. That also explains why Super Nintendo games seem to look bit larger and the characters were a bit bigger, like especially games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. They were bigger, they looked bigger on Super Nintendo. But like I said, the Genesis had a faster CPU, so the gameplay was just as good, if just as good as the Super Nintendo, if not maybe a bit faster. Now, and the final thing I want to talk about is the sound RAM. The Super Nintendo had 64 kilobytes for sound, RAM for sound, memory for sound, and the Genesis had 8 kilobyte for sound, which explains why Super Nintendo games also sound better than Sega Genesis games. So that was it, guys, and that is the video. So again, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis have a faster CPU than the Super Nintendo. And so that's the video. I'd like to thank you guys for watching. Please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe, as I will be bringing more content talking about video games and the video game industry. So take care. Have a nice day. Peace.